Welcome all to the September edition of DNA Dialogue. As we gather for this symposium, let's take a moment to reflect on the meaning of place, and in doing so, recognise the various traditional lands from which we're coming together today. I'm joining you from Narm, or Melbourne, the country of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to extend my respect to the elders past and present of this land and all the lands we work and live on, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. So DNA Dialogue is a forum for members of the genomics community in Australia and beyond to learn of new developments in health genomics and particularly the overseas experience. These seminars are held via Zoom on the last Thursday of every month at 8 a.m. Eastern. Now, if you're active on social media, which I'm not very good at, but anyway, we encourage you to use the hashtag DNA Dialogue, and also please tag at OzGenomics and at EthicsWCS. So we do like these to be interactive sessions. So if you have questions during the talk, please use the Q&A function. And I will sort of triage the questions and deliver as many as I can to Richard at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Richard Milne, who is a sociologist of science, technology and medicine. And he has worked closely throughout his career with life scientists. He's the head of research and dialogue at the Wellcome Connecting Science, based at Wellcome Genome Campus in Hingston. And he's also Deputy Director of the new Kavli Centre for Ethics, Science and the Public at the University of Cambridge, and co-lead for Ethics, Law and Society in Cambridge Public Health. So Richard today will be presenting his findings from the international Your DNA, Your Say study, which was exploring public perspectives on the sharing of genomic data, including data. Well, that study included data collected from 37,000 respondents across 22 countries. Richard, it's fantastic for you to join us today, or this evening for you, and thank you again for joining us at this hour.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and thanks everybody for coming. And I hope that it's of interest. The work that we've been doing is of interest. Let me share my screen. So can you see that? That
looks great, Richard. Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, yeah. So thanks for that introduction. I'm Richard. I work at Wellcome Connecting Science, which within a team called Engagement and Society, which is led by Professor Anna Middleton, who also led a lot of the work that I'm going to be talking to you about this morning. And we do a lot of work around public engagement with genomics, public understanding of genomics, social science, and kind of ethics research around genomics. So do get in touch if any of this is of interest, any of the things I talk about this evening are of interest, or if you want to check out our team site. So yeah, so I'm going to be talking about a study called Your DNA, Your Say, which ran over about five years. When we stopped data collection just before the pandemic, and have been working through some of the data since then. But just to give you some context of what the area of interest for us is, and why we're particularly interested in data, and this probably won't come as a surprise to many of you, but just for those for whom this is a new area. Genomics is increasingly data-driven field, and in depictions like these ones from the National Human Genome Research Institute in the US, or from Genomics England, you capture this idea of a learning health system in which data flows between healthcare and research. Research findings flow back into healthcare, generate data, and that flows then back into the research process. And this isn't just something that's happening in the UK or the US or Australia. It's something that's happening around the world. There's this proliferation of genomic data initiatives, increasingly large genomic data sets being gathered around the world. And as part of this, there's the kind of increasing recognition that the public acceptance of the collection and sharing of genomic and health data is essential to the success of these genomics initiatives, or even to what some have described as the social license, their social license. And in addition to their general success, it's also essential to ensuring that the genomic data sets are able to collect data that reflects the diversity of the populations that they serve. But while there has been a tradition of research around public attitudes towards genetics, previously public attitudes towards biobanking, and then into the genomics and these kind of genomics initiatives, it's been quite heavily concentrated in certain geographies, most notably in the USA, but also in Europe. And there's been little ability to compare and contrast what it is that how different public groups around the world engage with genomics and the concerns and questions that it raises, which is the context that that we came into with the Your DNA, Your Say study. So this study was developed initially as part of the work of the Regulatory and Ethics Workstream of the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, GA4GH, and has since expanded and kept growing and growing and growing. So at the point at which we did most of our large-scale data analysis, kind of just at the start of the pandemic, we had just under 37,000 respondents from 22 countries in 15 languages. And these were from populations that from the samples in each country were as close as we could get to being representative of the population of the census data from that country. Since then, we've developed new collaborations with Ireland. We're also collecting data in Ghana as well. We have a PhD student working in Ghana. The translation process in itself and the process of getting this survey delivered in all these different languages around quite technical subjects has been a journey, not least for kind of web design teams as well. We're trying to get everything to keep looking how it should. But essentially, at the heart of the survey is a series of videos and text that take people completing it through a kind of an explanation of what genomic data and what genomic and health data are, why they would be collected, who would be using them, and for what kinds of purposes, and then ask a series of questions around them. The data from the survey are all now publicly available. There's a link at the end of this talk. There's a series of publications also that I've put references at the end of the talk. It's a video-based online survey, so it has some limitations in terms of the types of data we're able to collect and the types of populations that we've collected it from. And these are things that I think as we go forwards into kind of follow-on work that we want to follow up. I think, although I'm going to show you some findings, one of the most exciting things for me about all this research is the kind of questions and the new directions that it takes us in. So what I'm going to focus on in this talk is the work that we've done exploring people's willingness to donate their DNA or health data, what that looks like across the different countries in which we've worked, and the things that influence that. And I'm going to spend a bit more time towards the end talking about my specific area of interest, which is around trust and the role of public trust. So this is probably the most significant paper that kind of sets out some of this work, published in the American Journal of Human Genetics in 2020, with this fantastic team of collaborators. And the central question to that is, how willing are people to donate their data, to donate data about themselves to at least somebody involved in genomics? And what we find across the 22 countries that we looked at is that between a third and 2/3 of people said that they would be willing to donate, from a high in Mexico and down to a low in Japan. And I've just picked out Australia there, which is just slightly above the UK, in the mid-40%, kind of mid-40s% of people saying that they would be willing to donate their data. And for those of you who are familiar with some of the kind of previous research on public attitudes around genomics, it may not come as a surprise to find that the willingness of people to donate varies substantially between doctors and non-profit researchers on the one hand, and for-profit or company researchers on the other hand. But in our sample as well, the difference between people's willingness to donate for-profit versus non-profit research was the greatest in countries like the UK, Spain, Germany, Poland, and narrowest in India, Egypt, China, and the United States. In general, there was very little difference in people's willingness to donate for use by medical doctors or for non-profit researchers, with a couple of exceptions. So you can see here Sweden, Russia, and India, where that gap was larger. But that's the kind of descriptive picture. But then what we were interested in as well is what are the things that the other things that we've asked about that influence people's willingness to donate their data. So one of the most significant things that came out as a driver of willingness to donate was familiarity with genomics. So across the sample as a whole, 64% of people said that they were unfamiliar with DNA, genetics, and genomics. And that's relatively consistent. But and of those people who said that they were familiar, the majority across the board and in Australia as well, were familiar with DNA, genetics, and genomics through an existing interest in ancestry and genealogy. There were various other ways that we asked about how people might have become familiar with genetics. So through taking part in research, through having a genetic condition in their family, or perhaps working in a clinical context or working in a context that involved genetics in some way, or through direct-to-consumer genetics, which as a whole was around 7% of people across the sample, with a high of 19% in the USA, as you'd expect, being the market where DTC genetics has got the highest penetrance. In Australia, at the time that we asked, it was 5%, which may have gone up since then. So familiarity across the board, so people who said that they were familiar with DNA, genetics, and genomics had significantly greater odds of being willing to donate across the sample as a whole. But those people who had some kind of personal connection with genetics, so being patients with genetic condition, having a family history, or working with patients, for that group, the odds of being willing to donate were even greater, and it was a really, so it's it was very strongly associated with that willingness to donate. Another thing that was also, which I'm not going to touch on in much detail this morning, is whether people felt that DNA was different to other types of genetic information, and that was something that's been a back and forth and a kind of a debate since the early days of kind of clinical genetics. Right? Is there something exceptional about genetic information that's different to other types of information that we give about ourselves? And what was fascinating was that the sample essentially split without a great deal of pattern, but consistently across the sample, those people who felt that DNA was different to other types of information were also more willing to donate it. And then one thing that we were also interested in that comes out in the bioethics debates, particularly around genetics and genetics research, is what to do with the findings that come out of research, the research findings particularly, rather than perhaps the clinical findings. And this is something that the policy positions over the last 20 years or so have shifted quite dramatically from the days of UK Biobank with its policy around non-return of results, through to the launch of All of Us, or in the UK, Our Future Health, which have some kind of commitment to returning, if not all data, at least some kinds of findings, or some kinds of findings, data, or results back to participants. And so we asked people the extent to which they would be motivated to donate their data by receiving a readout of their results in return. And I think that the interesting thing that we found was that across all of the countries, the population of our respondents who said that they would be most likely to be wholly influenced to donate data by receiving a readout of results was in the United States. And that other countries, so here I've shown the UK and Australia, in other countries, the respondents were far less likely to say that they were wholly influenced by receiving this data back. So we know from lots of studies, including a phenomenal systematic review that was done by Danya Veers as part of the GA4GH work, that that participants in research value receiving feedback and receiving information. But what we seem to be finding in this data is that whilst people may value it, it may not be the kind of clincher in terms of making a decision to become involved in the first place. And just to give you a bit more detail on that, so this is taking taking the US as the comparator here, and the odds to which somebody was like respondents in different countries were likely to say that they were either not influenced or wholly influenced in their decision to donate their data by receiving a readout of their results in return. And what you find is that there were no countries that where there was a significantly greater likelihood of being wholly influenced than the US, with many countries being far to the left and far less likely to be wholly influenced, and many countries being more likely to say that they would not be, respondents in many countries being far more likely to say that they would not be influenced by receiving a readout of their results overall. And I think in terms of kind of practical implications of it, it's I think a cautionary note that to kind of attend to where the data that we already have around public attitudes comes from, and what we might need to generate, what we might need to look at in the future. And then the kind of final substantive thing that I'm going to come on to in terms of our findings is around trust. So we know from again from the kind of body of existing work, and particularly the work of Christine Critchley, Diane Nicol, and people in Australia, that trust is a really strong really strongly shapes people's attitudes towards health data, genomics, and their intention to participate in research. And it's also something that's very much at the heart of things like the UK's Genome UK policy, or the NHGRI's policy for the future of genomics, both of which place a great emphasis on putting in place the systems and policies that help build trust in these initiatives. So what we were interested in here is what trust in genomic data systems looks like, and its role in influencing the willingness to donate. So what we found, again reflecting the differences in the willingness to donate, was that, as you might expect, people trust different organizations differently with data about them. So respondents across our sample consistently said that they would trust their own doctor with their DNA and health information. And this was even in healthcare systems where people didn't necessarily have a kind of single doctor, kind of a local GP or family doctor. But that idea of somebody's own doctor being trusted was really kind of powerful all the way through the data set. Once we weren't talking about trusting one's own doctor with data, things dropped off quite dramatically, as you can see. So the trust in any medical doctor with data or university researchers at 30 and 32%, trust in company researchers being substantially lower at 14%, and trust in government at 20%. And this pattern's been highlighted, not least from the work that Christine Critchley and Dan Nichol have done in Australia, as well as work that the Wellcome Trust and others have done in the UK. And it presents this kind of continual challenge at the moment for initiatives which are increasingly public-private collaborations, in which it's often quite difficult to draw clear lines between university uses of data or company research uses of data, or in which the establishment of the initiative may be predicated on using data for not just health but also for wealth generation. What we found additionally was that regardless of which organization or actor you were talking about in terms of within your country, as soon as you went outside the country, they were trusted even less. So medical doctors were trusted less. Medical doctors worldwide were trusted less than doctors within the country. Company researchers worldwide were trusted even less than outside the country. So we have this kind of pattern of within country trust being greater than outside country trust, which has implications as well within the kind of, as we're trying to establish kind of global systems in which we allow or attempt to allow data use to be kind of international. Just to move away from that general picture again, to give you an idea of what the data looked like from our Australian sample. It's much the same picture again, with the trust in one's own medical doctor being the highest through various different actors within Australia, and then through to those worldwide. But so then the question is, does this make a difference to people's willingness to donate? Is trust actually a significant driver? And what we found is that yes, it is. That essentially the people who are more trusting were more willing to donate their data. So if you split the sample in terms of people who trusted more than one organization, so usually their own doctor plus somebody else, 66 out of 100 of those people would be willing to donate their DNA and medical information. Whereas for those who essentially either only trusted their own doctor or said that they didn't trust anybody, only 34 out of 100 would be willing to donate their DNA and medical information. We also found that trust in each different actor, so trust in companies, for example, was associated with increased willingness to donate for data use by that actor. In terms of understanding who these people were, we've done some latent class analysis modeling, so trying to kind of identify clusters essentially within the overall population of people who are in this higher trusting group. And particularly within data from the UK, USA, Australia, and Canada, which was the first data we collected, we found that that members of the highest trust group were more likely to be male, more likely to have personal experience of genetics, more likely to be younger. So given the importance of trust as a potential influence on people's willingness to take part in genomic data initiatives, the question arises inevitably of what can we do to build trust? And this is where we and others make a shift from talking about building trust to talking about being trustworthy. And essentially the purpose of this switch is to recognize that when we talk about trust, we essentially end up talking about, so as I just did, about the characteristics of the types of people who trust. And we're focusing on the features of the person who's placing their trust, and which are shaped by their experiences, beliefs, knowledges, and to an extent their dispositions, their trustfulness. Which, when you're talking about making policy or building genomic data initiatives, are difficult things to influence, and certainly difficult things to control. Trustworthiness, on the other hand, is a feature of the object of trust itself. Is the kind of question about whether the whether the organization or the individual is reliable in the right kind of way. Do they make appropriate commitments? Do they have the right kinds of values? And these are the kinds of things that are more tractable, essentially, I think, for those involved in genomics. And so we asked people within our survey what kinds of features of a genomics initiative might help people trust. And so we gave a list of items and asked people to kind of select the ones that they felt applied. We then ranked those choices across the sample as a whole, both just as a kind of a gross ranking in terms of the number of people selecting, and also as a weighted by country. And we came out with the same order each way, with the most important things that people said would help them have trust being information about who's going to benefit from access of data, the option to withdraw, knowing who's using data and why, what they're doing with it, and then into things like information about how others will benefit from the data, from data access. And this was somewhere where, so each of these options had a little kind of bit of explanatory text. And particularly for this fourth one, it was to clarify that this was about knowing, how's a company going to benefit from using your data, but also how is a university researcher going to benefit from using the data? How is a clinician going to benefit themselves from using the data in terms of their own kind of their own career pathway? And so what's useful about these findings is also that they align conceptually with some of the things that we already think are important around building trust and being trustworthy, particularly around transparency and around the importance of some of the research ethics and medical ethics provisions around data and data ethics provisions around things like withdrawal. What was fascinating, though, was that within this overall ranking was a varied national patterning of the importance of these measures. So overall, people wanted to know who was going to benefit from the use of their data. But what we have highlighted here is just is a selection of the 22 countries, and the three most important options that were selected by respondents in each country. And so what you see is Australia and the UK follow the same pattern around the importance of who's going to benefit, how you withdraw, the option to withdraw, and how others will benefit. In some countries, so in China, for example, the thing that came out most importantly was the ability to opt out of data use rather than necessarily withdrawing, but the ability to kind of opt out on a use-by-use basis. In Japan, the use of the details of the sanctions that would be applied in the case of data misuse were the most important. And so what we found was this, what was important to people varied across countries. And actually, when you looked at how those rankings correlated across the sample, what we found was that what people said was important was more alike in some countries than others. So, for example, Spain and Mexico, the rankings that came out were very similar. Poland and France. The Australia clustered with the UK and Italy, but some countries were far more distant. So if you look within these kind of these clades, the further you go up the tree, essentially the less connected the countries are. And then what we ended up with was this group of Russia, Japan, and China, where the differences in the ordering of these different measures was greater than from the other 19 countries. And regardless of, I suppose, the kind of fine detail, I think what the message that we've taken away from this as well is the fact that the more we can understand this variation, the more it may be useful in terms of the ambition of organizations like GA4GH and others in terms of setting international standards. How acceptable and how valid are those standards going to be internationally in terms of giving in terms of ensuring the trustworthiness of genomic data initiatives. So I'm running out of time. So I want to just to summarize what I've covered so far is that this kind of willingness to donate genomic and health data is influenced by these factors, including familiarity, trust, and how people see genetic information. But with a cautionary note about the importance of receiving findings back or receiving data back may not be as strong a motivator as has been suggested by the kind of largest body of existing public attitudes research in this area. Trust varies in relation to who it's being granted to, and that we've identified some of what we hope are kind of global qualities of a trustworthy genomic data system, but that these vary. And so Tiff, in the brief for this, asked me as well to kind of think about where we're going next and what are some of the questions that this work's raised for us, and where are we hoping to explore in the future. And I think that there are three real areas that we've taken from this and are trying to build on, and that we'd love to kind of engage in conversation with about. So the first is around this question of familiarity and what that means. And I think that for us, emphatically, it's not been a case of the need to understand the science in great detail. It's about the ability to to recognize and appreciate that maybe the kind of salience of it within everyday life, or within the potential salience of it within life. And that actually, once you move away from that first part of kind of leading with the scientific knowledge, it leaves us in a space that we're exploring at the moment. It's like, what's the starting point for kind of better public conversations around genomics? And how does that vary by context with different populations within and between countries? Questions around involvement and building trustworthy systems. So a survey is great. It gives us lots of nice graphs, but it's only one means of eliciting public perspectives around genomics. And actually, there's a question of what is the place for public voices in genomics research, and how does this again vary depending on what we're trying to do. And then finally, for me, I think there's lots of questions coming up, particularly around trust. So particularly around the circumstances in which trust is most necessary. So particularly if we're talking about groups where that may not fit that the characteristics of the high trust group I described, or that have historic and social reasons for being reasonably distrustful. Trust may play a much greater role than it does in some settings. But equally, I think that there are circumstances in which we might want to recognize that trust might not be what we're after at all, and that what we might want is the ability to have kind of strict regulation and sanctions that don't necessitate the existence of trust in order to function. And I think much greater exploration of the kinds of qualities that are associated with trustworthy data custodians, how those qualities are valued by members of diverse publics and the scientific collaborators that are working with them, what kinds of activities usefully exhibit those qualities, and what difference does that make to where we end up. And then some of the kind of trade-offs that we make as individuals and as institutions in doing that and trying to ensure trust. So I'll leave it there. Hopefully, I'm very happy to answer questions for as long as they come, and as long as the time we have. I just wanted to say thanks to all our collaborators, to that huge group of people who've been involved in developing the study, collecting the data and analysing it, to the funders, and obviously to the 37,000 people who took part in the study, particularly at Connecting Science, to Anna, who designed and led the study. And also the better charts in this presentation were developed by our graphic designer Lara as part of work with the GA4GH. And hopefully the slides should be available to you afterwards, but there's some links here to the data set, to a series of seminars that we've run, which are all on YouTube, around some of the meta-analysis and the individual country analyses from your DNA, you'll say, in a bit more depth. And with Diane Nicol, Malia Raven Adams, and GA4GH Group on Public Attitudes for Genomic Policy, we're also launching a series of briefs around. So these are aimed at being kind of short summaries for that are potentially kind of policy relevant findings from your DNA, your say, and other public attitudes to genomics research. So I will stop there and answer any questions that you have.
Richard, thank you so much. Fantastic talk. Your DNA, your study is just a tour de force. It's an amazing data set. And I'm sure, as you indicated, all the different avenues you can explore from the data set. I'm sure it's sort of snowballing research as you go.
It's a difficult thing to stop playing with.
Absolutely. I think too, from my perspective and your reflections on the different levels of trust for different agents across different countries, and the implications for GA4GH in developing sort of policies and practice that are more standardized internationally. I think too, particularly the different trust in agents locally versus overseas should be one that we look at more carefully in the context of, for example, the Dury work stream, where there's been a reluctance to have geographic restrictions on sharing data. However, perhaps we should look at this more closely in the context of the willingness to share within one's country versus overseas.
Yeah, I think there's there's a small amount of evidence from the States as well. There was a study from a couple of years ago around attitudes towards overseas data users as opposed to internal data users, and there's there are questions that have come up, for example, in the news in the UK around the use of UK biobank data and the kind of countries where countries that people are accessing UK biobank data from, and the potential ability to can we control that? Do we know what's happening, and that mistrust of overseas users. So I think that there is a question of how much do we bake the ability to make those distinctions into the data sets, and how much do we I think it's I think the technical question I think will be really interesting to explore as well.
Indeed.
How we want to go with that.
Now, I'm not going to monopolise you, even though I could chat about this all day. We have got lots of questions coming in on the Q&A. So Shelley asks that even within the groups of higher probability to donate, or across all groups, what is your perceived impact of data breaches, as we've recently seen in Australia with Optus, on willingness to donate, particularly focusing on sort of data security perspective, as well as initial willingness to participate?
Yeah. So it's a great question. I think it's a really, it also, though, I think speaks to one of the limitations of Your DNA, Your Say as a cross-sectional survey, that ideally, it would be great to be able to follow it up after a data breach has happened, to be able to see some kind of before and after. One of the things that we do have is simply the kind of free text responses and the and people's concerns about what people's concerns about data use and data misuse are. And the things that repeatedly come out the highest are the use for insurance and marketing purposes. So it is that kind of sense of data being used, if not nefariously, at least not for the purposes that it was that people had imagined it happening in the first place, or people talking kind of anecdotally in the comments, in the open text responses about their experience of having been a victim of data breaches in the past. One of the absolutely fascinating things that we found when we looked at those, so with this latent class analysis that I skipped over quite briefly, so we identified 3 groups within that 4-country sample, which we called a kind of high trust group, a low trust group, and then the variable trust group. And the variable trust group was actually the largest group, and they were the ones who followed that kind of pattern of discrimination, of kind of like trusting doctor, then researchers, then companies. The high trust group essentially trusted everybody, and the low trust group essentially trusted nobody. But the high trust group were also the most likely to have been the victim of a data breach, or to say that their data had been used wrongly in the past, which is, I suppose, nice in that it hadn't dented their trust, but also implies that there is a cost that comes with being a high trust individual, that you are more likely to put yourself in positions where your data is vulnerable.
Well, in the context of life more broadly as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a dangerous thing to do.
All right. Now, there are a couple of questions regarding the pattern. So, of COVID and the implications or impact of COVID on public views of genomic data sharing, understanding that most of the data collection completed before the pandemic. Have you got any insights there?
No, I mean, this is the really big question that keeps coming up, and basically is that we need to redo things to see. We need to redo the to see what's changed, and also the persistence of change as well. I think, I think policy, and in the UK, I mean, particularly we have this review by Ben Goldacre of kind of health data use across the NHS, and the kind of making how you make health data more available for research, and the idea that there is a learning from the COVID experience that will become more systematic and embedded. The question of how that use of data in the kind of COVID context has a lasting effect on public attitudes, I'm not sure about. And one of the features of starting to go into winter in the UK, I think, is the way that it feels much more like winter 2019 than it does winter kind of 2021 or winter 2020. So things tend to rebound quite quickly.
All right, very interesting. All right, Marianne asks, in what way do you think geopolitical issues impact trust and genomics?
It's a good question. I think fairly significantly, in terms of, I suppose, that question of which countries do you imagine that you would share data with, because I mean there are already countries with which, so genomic data initiatives often will not share data or will not allow access to data from anyway, but for geopolitical reasons. And then there's a kind of larger group of countries which probably fall into a category of countries that are perhaps less acceptable to the public, but still politically acceptable. So I think I'm sure it all plays into it.
Yeah. All right. So Danya asks, or states, interesting data showing that not many people are solely motivated by return of results. And then asks, but surely if we're trying to encourage data donation, then any degree of increased motivation is worth considering.
Hi, Danya. I think I have kind of two thoughts. One of which is that I'm not sure that we necessarily, if we do want to increase donation, that we want it to be a kind of transaction. I don't think that using kind of data to as part of a kind of deal is necessarily the way forwards. That said, I also think that there are far better reasons for returning results and returning findings than the idea that it will motivate participation. I think there are kind of very valid reasons around that kind of respecting people's participation, and particularly, I mean, obviously when those are kind of clinically actionable and things, it's a different question. But I think if we want to make the argument around why we should return results, I think that there are kind of good ethical arguments around it that don't need the motivation.
Unless perhaps you're establishing a study in the US where it might actually work quite effectively.
It might do, yes.
All right, we've had a couple of questions on First Nations responses. So Louise asks, recognising that you may not have data from Indigenous Australians, has the data set allowed you to identify sort of globally First Nations subset, and do those responses differ from other populations?
No, I wish they did, but we don't have any data on we don't have any data on that. But we don't have that ability to break down kind of populations in that way. So,
okay, yeah.
Which is
It's a very interesting question though in the context.
It is an interesting question. I think
All right. So Bronwyn states she was very interested in your thoughts about public conversations, not about the science, but about the salience or relevance of genomics to everyday life and different conversations in different contexts. Are there plans for a broader public conversation along these lines in the UK? And how do you envisage that would be facilitated?
So it's definitely something that we're very interested in, and are trying to talking to kind of various people about trying to get up and running. At the moment, nothing concrete, but as a kind of, I hope to be able to come back to you at some point with something more concrete.
Excellent. An update talk next year, perhaps, at a less unfriendly time for you.
I'm quite enjoying the
All right. Anonymous asks, could you comment further on sanctions for misuse of data? Who monitors and regulates that in different countries? Presumably a challenge to set standards in that area internationally.
Yeah, I think, internationally, I think definitely. I mean, within the UK and the EU, within the EU, definitely you have the GDPR, and now you have kind of the UK Data Protection Act that in theory will enable those kinds of sanctions to be broad. I think one of the interesting things is the distinction between the kind of existence of sanctions and the enforcement of sanctions. I think that it's one thing having the sanctions, but if they're not seen to be enforced, then you start to kind of lose trust in the sanction regime itself. And so, I mean, the EU has a kind of increasing backlog of sanctions that haven't been processed around GDPR violations. So, so kind of essentially it is national data protection authorities or kind of transnational data protection authorities where those exist.
All right. So Ainsley asks, do you see a distinction between attitudes of sharing data as opposed to tissue or material? For example, she believes there are some similar views held by biobank participants, such as trust and sharing across borders. This we touched on earlier a little bit in your answer. Yeah,
I mean, I think I don't. I haven't made the comparison. I would be surprised if there was a substantial deviation. I suppose it's the only kind of practical difference is that the sharing of data is far simpler. But whether that has an effect on public attitudes, I don't know.
Fair enough. Are you happy for me to keep peppering you with questions?
Yeah, keep going.
You're not going anywhere. It's middle of the night.
Exactly.
All right. So Julia observes that for research on precision health and implementation of tailored interventions to support health in practice, it's important to combine genetic data with detailed information on lifestyles and medical history. What are your thoughts on people's willingness to share this information alongside their genetic data? Of course I did. I participated in the Your DNA, Your Say, but I can't remember. I know there was reference to data and medical information, but was that described in more depth, or did you see any granularity in that?
So it is described as kind of genomic and health data. So it's the kind of joined together. We've also been doing some recent work around attitudes towards data-driven medicine more generally, and particularly the use of non-traditional health data. So data from kind of wearables and smartphones and kind of passively collected data, and that the overall pattern of kind of how people's willingness to share, or the acceptability of sharing data with different organizations, follows very much that same pattern.
I think too, I mean, many of the questions we're getting are sort of looking to the tangible implications of this research on practice and policy. So for example, Chirag notes that he recently had a parent who wanted to personally read and review the testing lab's policy on sample and data storage and access before proceeding to clinical genomic testing. But he has found that not all labs have a clear policy to document this in order to provide it to PO, in terms of a very practical strategy to progress public trust in clinical genomic testing, let alone research. Developing these policies and providing them to patients and the public, would be very important.
Yeah, and I think that's when we've in those questions about kind of measures to increase trust. I think that's what we're trying to pull out. Some of those kind of practical things that we might do to make to make clinics, data centers, whatever, and more trustworthy, or at least to be able to evidence their trustworthiness. And I think those things about how this data is going to be used and by whom are things that should be part of that picture, regardless of where the patient or participant is encountering the data. That follow it through the pipeline.
I think too, I mean, sort of an extension of that, there's a number of questions around the trust in companies, or lack thereof, in terms of sharing the data. And MJ points out that it's a concern around the future of medical innovation if the trust in companies is so low. I think too, certainly in Australia, even in the context of clinical genomic testing, the data may have implications for risk-rated insurance under our moratorium. So that's extending beyond the research realm and into actual clinical practice.
No, and I think, this is, I think for me, that question that I skipped a bit at the end, but about the points at which we don't want to be trusting anymore. So if I put my money in the bank, I don't have to trust that the bank is going to keep that money. I can rely on the fact that there is a kind of regulated banking system that will be, it'll just be reliable. It doesn't require me to kind of, with trust, there's always that kind of unknown. There's always an element of uncertainty associated with trust. And actually, if my data's going to a company or my money's going to a bank, I don't want there to be the uncertainty. I want there to be a kind of level of reliability. So there is a point at which, there's a point at which, it might be reasonable to trust a doctor or a researcher, but actually when you move into the kind of areas where the stakes are perhaps higher, it may not be trust that we're after.
Yes, which certainly has implications for the self-regulated moratorium that we have in place in Australia, which might not be adequate protections. I might ask one more question, if I may, from Jack. You mentioned involvement rather than engagement of the public. Are you or any organisations you're affiliated with planning any work to involve people in research rather than simply engage? Yes, I think is at a very kind of, so the work that the team that I lead at Connecting Science is research and dialogue, and a major part of that is the dialogue part, and trying to bring patients, members of the public, into the research process throughout the research process. So, for example, we've kind of recently set up a community advisory panel and to try and bring that into the context of
kind of science that's going on the genome campus, a lot of which is very kind of discovery science as well. So that's the kind of goal, and that's what we're working towards in both Connecting Science and the Carpley Centre. But the big public attitudes survey stuff is part of the picture, but there's also the more in-depth, kind of engaged, or involved, kind of direct public dialogue with researchers and with the research process.
No, it's certainly something we're very passionate about as well, and have a project that Jack is actually sort of very much part of in sort of Involve Australia, working out guidelines for more tangible involvement of the public and the community in genomic research.
And actually, I just say because I think one of the things that's really nice about the work that you're doing and that Jack's doing as well is the writing up a bit and the kind of telling the story, because I think that there are a variety of these kind of efforts at involvement, but often the story doesn't get told about them. So it's kind of that then the ability to learn from and kind of celebrate those as meaningful activities that are kind of doing something that we can build on can be. So
oh, that's a wonderful, rousing way to finish the presentation. Richard, thank you so much. I hope you're going to be able to sleep after this. It's been such an engaging sort of, not only the presentation, but then the involvement of the questions, etc., has been fantastic.
No, thank you so much for the questions and for the chance to talk. And that's I think let's do more late night things. So thanks. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you, Richard. And thank you all for joining us this morning for the DNA Dialogue. Next seminar will be held on October 27th and will feature Professor Dean Regier from the BC Cancer at University of British Columbia in Canada, with a talk entitled Life Cycle Health Technology Assessment, Real-World Evidence for Precision Medicine. So thank you all again for joining us, and we'll see you next month. Bye-bye.